Practice your watercolor illustration as we master the 12 birth flowers in this beginner-friendly art tutorial. Hey friends, welcome back. My name is Shayda Campbell and I love getting creative with you. In today's tutorial, we're covering all 12 birth flowers. These are so great for use on birthday cards and journal spreads. I go back to them again and again. So today we're going to explore not only how to draw them, but how to create a really lovely watercolor illustration using my Shayda Campbell paints and a bit of brush pen. Let's sit down at my desk and I'll show you my supplies a little more in depth. Cup of tea, obviously. And then I have my set of watercolors. I'm so proud of these. A lot of you have reached out to tell me how much you love them, how much you love the pigments. Obviously, I feel the exact same way, and I'm very happy with the colors since I handpicked them myself. And if you want to follow along with these tutorials with the exact same set, I highly recommend. Link is in the description, but of course, use any watercolors you can get your hands on. Okay, and then we're going to use a pencil and eraser, as well as a couple of brush pens, and mine are from Faber-Castell, and you'll notice on the pen it says SB, and that stands for soft brush, and B, which is brush. The brush is just a slightly harder nib, but still very fine and delicate, and I like both of them. Okay, let's start in pencil. So the first flower is January, and that is the Carnation. So I like to do a circle showing me how big the flower will be. I do 4 little ruffled petals at center, and then I just do a whole bunch of ruffly lines. You're going to do a V below the flower, and then bring that V down into a stem shape. And then I did one on an angle, but don't worry, I'm gonna go over it in pen again. So using my nice delicate brush pen, we are going to go over those 4 petals at center using very thin, delicate, fine lines. The nice thing about the brush pen is that it kind of acts like a paintbrush, and you can add a little extra pressure when you want a thicker line. And doing those thick and thin lines the way you would, say, with hand lettering is going to give you a really beautiful illustrative quality to your drawings. So I'm doing pretty thin lines for all of the delicate carnation petals, and then we're going to do that sort of V shape at the bottom below the flower, bring it down into a thick stem, and then we have these tiny little leaves that go off from both sides of the stem. And then I'm doing the same thing over here, but this time the flower is more of a semicircle than a circle. So I have one carnation kind of facing my viewer and one that's on a bit of an angle. And then we're going to take a fine liner. Sorry, I didn't mention that in the supplies. It is my way to miss one supply, and I'm just gonna write Carnation above it. Okay, moving right along, because we got a lot of flowers to cover. For February, the birth flower is violets. So I did 2 circles, and then you do a big circle at the front or bottom, 2 circles kind of in behind, and then one finally at the very back. The pansy or violet, the petals are sort of layered in that way. I'll write violet beneath those flowers, and then we're going to move right along to March, the daffodil. Circle with an X through it, becomes 5 petals, and then the stamen in the center is kind of a mess, and then you're going to do that Y shape or V below the flower with the thin stem and 2 leaves. Let's do the stamen again. It's kind of a big starburst with a bit of a cup shape below it. Okay, I'm going to go over these in pen so you can see again. I get another chance at explaining. The violets or pansies, as long as that front or bottom petal is kind of sitting out in front of the other ones and the petals are quite rounded, they tend to look pretty good. And I did sort of like a messy flower on an angle, some leaf shapes there, and I can always add more leaves when I go in and add the watercolor. Okay, we're going to start with the stamen here. So it's kind of a messy circle, and then just do some little lines below it to give it that depth and give it that height. And then my 5 petals, and I've given them a little more shape now that I'm working with the brush pen. And then I've pulled down on that pen, added a bit more pressure as I draw the sepal and the stem and the leaves that are all sitting below the flower. Okay, so we'll come back in with our fine liner. I'm using a 0.5mm nib, and we're writing daffodil and violet, and it looks so cute. So there's January, February, and March. Let's keep it moving. Daisy for April. I started with an oval, And then you can see how I do a guide, a little line where each petal is going to sit. And that really helps me to draw an angled flower. While working in pencil, start with the oval. How big is the flower? Then the lines, which direction and how long is each petal? And then by the time you're going over everything in pen with that nice, flexible brush pen, you're really thinking about the movement and life and shape that you want to give each petal and each leaf. So you're not concentrating on what size is this petal or which direction is it going. And I have lots of videos on that. If you'd like to check out my videos on depth and perspective, I'll link one in the description. And then I also have a floral illustration e-course at shaydacampbell.com where we go over all of this stuff in depth. Okay, so for May, Lily of the Valley, one of my favorite flowers to draw. And then for June, we have the rose. So again, a guide. Start with a circle. How big is the rose? Then I like to do these little C shapes at the center. And then from there, you just go around and keep adding layers and layers of petals. For the lily of the valley, I usually do 2 cane shapes for the stems, and then I just put a bunch of ovals along each stem. And then when I come in pen, I make those ovals or bell shapes a little bit more pronounced and add that scalloped edge to the bottom of each little blossom. And we're doing these 2 large leaves to frame the flowers as well. And then you want to go over the stems with your pen. And then for the rose, start with a grouping of C shapes at center, and you're just going around and around, adding all of these little petals, and you keep, as you move outward, they get bigger and bigger. I probably did mine a little too roughly, added a little too much texture, but that's okay. And then because I've done a guide for those leaves, I can give the leaves a bit of a toothy edge as well while working in pen. And then with fine liner, we're writing Rose and Lily of the Valley, and it looks so cute. Okay, at this point, you'll notice I've sketched in the other 6 flowers because I was like, am I going to have room for 6 more? The answer is yes, phew. So next up, water lily for the month of July. And it is a fun lotus illustration where you start with that front petal and then put 1 on the left, 1 on the right, 2 in behind, and then you can kind of place 3 petals at the base falling away. And then I just did a few curving lines for the lily pad. For August, it's a gladiola. Start with a curving line and place 2 large circles, and then up above you'll have some little buds. Give the circles a nice ruffled or toothy edge. Place a curving line low in that circle, and that's going to help give the flower its trumpet shape or its concave look, and you can see how I'm doing that there. We'll thicken the stem, go over the leaves, and I left a little space for the title. And then over here for September, we have asters. Again, a great one to start with a guide, because with asters, I thought it'd be cute to do multiples since they are a smaller flower that grows in groupings. So I've drawn 4 and just done the petals and the stamens in pencil. And then by the time I go over it in pen, I know where I want everything to sit. I know how large those flowers are going to be and how long the petals are, and I can be really messy and free going over everything with the brush pen. And that's what we really want. When we erase the pencil, the brush pen that remains here, we want it to look very playful and effortless, I guess. And we do that by setting ourselves up for success with these pencil guides so that by the time we're working with the brush pen or the soft brush pen, we can be quite easy and use that brush pen in a way that benefits the illustration. The marigold is very similar to the carnation. So for the marigold, I started with those 4 ruffled petals in the middle and then went around and around doing layers or rings of these ruffled petals. And you can see the leaf shape there as well. For November, it's a chrysanthemum, and I start with 2 circles, 1 for the center, 1 for the full shape of the flower. And oh my gosh, it's just a mess of petals. On that inner circle, I draw the petals, which are long, thin ovals, kind of going in. And then everything outside of that inner circle, the petal shapes are moving out, like drawing the rays of the sun. But that's the chrysanthemum, very messy. I went back, added a little bit of line shading on the marigold. And then it is time for our December birth flower, which is Narcissus. Narcissus, also known as paper whites, is an easy one to simplify. You can basically just doodle some little flower shapes, like 4 petals, and then give it a stem and 2 big leaves. So really, really simple, but it's going to look so pretty. All of these we've just simplified as much as possible while still maintaining kind of the main points of the flower. So yes, I managed to get all 12 flowers on this sketchbook page. Quite an accomplishment, I would say. And then at the top, I kind of had some dead space, but it is the perfect place to put a title. So I wrote A Year of Flowers. Maybe it should have been A Year in Flowers. Oh well, that's okay. We'll write A Year of Flowers up there with my brush pen. And I think this looks so cute. I've gotten rid of all of the pencil lines. So you want to make sure that you're getting rid of your pencil sketches as you're working along. And then looking at the composition as a whole, I definitely noticed there was some dead space here between the daisy and the carnation. And the rest of the piece, everything is quite close together. So all I did was add another daisy. I did an angled flower. That is certainly something that I've done for many of these, is show 2 of the same flower. So by stepping back and looking at the overall composition with a critical eye, I was able to identify some spots that maybe needed another little leaf or something, and now I'm quite happy with the overall illustration. Now, I am so pleased with those illustrations. That could be a video, but I love you guys, and I know you're going to want to add some color. So grab your Shayda Campbell watercolor set or any watercolors that you happen to enjoy using, and all we're going to do is splash a bit of color on there, and it's going to look so good and so whimsical and playful and illustrative and amazing. I'm using a number 6 round brush for most of this. It's also nice to have a filbert on hand. And the first thing I did was reach for my olive green, and I put just a hint of magenta in there, and that is the color that we are going to use for most of this, most of the green on this piece, so that regardless of how many colors we use on the flowers, we have a green that's kind of uniform and doesn't change all that much from flower to flower. So you can see me just using the brush to fill in some of the leaves and stems. And the key here with all of this, with all of the color that we add, is that you want to leave some negative space. That is what is going to set your pieces apart and make you appear like super advanced and knowledgeable and artsy. If you can leave a little bit of negative space, that's going to show your viewer like, oh wow, that artist knows what she is doing. And I'll show you what I mean as we work through, but you can see some highlights on the leaves that I've already done, and that's what's making them look so cool. Okay, for the carnation, I used white with a hint of the peach pink, a hint of red brown, and a hint of rose madder hue. But basically it's white with a bit of red and a bit of that peach pink. Lots of white. And then we're just filling in, going right over the illustration. I didn't leave a ton of white or negative space there, so I'm gonna have to prove that point to you at some other time. Okay, for the pansies, white with a bit of ultramarine and a bit of magenta. Lots of white, obviously. Very light purpley. If you wanted a little bit more blue, add ultramarine. If you wanted a little bit more of a warm purple, add extra magenta. But we're just filling in, leaving some negative space around the edges. If your illustration is a coloring book image, you want to fill it in as if you don't really care that much. That's what's going to make it look cool. Okay, for the daisy, I am mixing white with a hint of Payne's gray. If it seems too cold, add a little bit of red brown or even add a little magenta. And then we're just putting like a line of gray, a hint, a droplet of gray on those 2 white flowers. Actually, we got 3 white flowers, so same thing on the narcissus. And then I went for a very light yellow. So this is Naples yellow with a whole bunch of white mixed in. And that's what I used on the daffodil and the gladiola. So anywhere I can, I want to carry through some colors. I don't want every illustration to be totally different. Some of the flowers are both white, so that's an easy choice. But other ones like pink and yellow, I want to repeat colors in certain areas. And certainly with the green, it is that olive green, or alternatively use the sap green and just put a little hint of magenta in it. And that'll give you a nice, earthy, natural green that's good for most of these. For the lily pad here, I just added extra water and then released a little bit of darker color. So using wet into wet to my advantage to give me a nice playful burst of color there. And then the next bit of green I'm going to do is, I think, the only one that I'm going to change the green slightly. So I added a hint of indigo to my green, and I just darkened my green blend a little for the lily of the valley because I wanted to have a really dark green there that would make the whites pop. And then I'm kind of just going back to my typical olive green, and I'll put a splash of color on the narcissus stems and branches and the gladiola. And I want to just put a little dot of green kind of in between those gladiola blooms, those flowers. Next up, I'm going to use a blend of my raw sienna and the Naples yellow that is in this set. That just gives me a really nice dark yellow or light brown, and that's perfect for my daisy stamen. Again, you can see I've just left a little bit of negative space there. It's not perfectly painted. It's not perfectly filled in with pigment. And then I added a bit of that magenta to my light pink that was sitting on the palette. And I'm adding just some little messy, ruffly lines, kind of darkening the edges of the carnation petals. If you feel like it looks too harsh, you can always lift a little color. That's what I did. I just take a paper towel or a clean brush and I lift up some of the pigment. I do that when I'm painting clouds, when I want to create natural highlights. So lifting is a good tool to have in your toolkit. Speaking of techniques like lifting, the next technique we're employing is wet on dry. So adding wet pigment on top of dry, just what it sounds like. That's what we did with the carnation, and now we've done it with the violets, just adding that little hint of dark purple at the center of each flower. And then I'm going to mix up an orange. So for that, I typically will use Naples yellow, light red, raw sienna. That gives me a nice natural orangey hue. So I added that color. Then you can see me using a clean wet brush to lift some of the color so it's not quite as intense. And then I decided to do a little wet on dry and add a slightly darker yellow near the center of the flower to give it a concave look. Oh, we're jumping all around here. Now we're going to go and paint some of the ones down at the bottom. I don't know, I just like to move how I like to move. You could paint all of the flowers first and then go back in and do the wet on dry, adding that little bit of darker color or contrast. Just be free. Be free, I say. The water lily, I've added magenta and white, and you can see the water lily is a great example of me being a very bad coloring book artist, so leaving lots of negative space. Same thing with the rose. I've splashed a bit of red on there. I've left lots of white page showing through. Then I decided to lift a little color so that it would be very, very light. Then I mixed a dark, rich red. So this was the rose madder hue and red brown mixed together, and then I just splash some more dark color on there. And we'll come down here and we'll add some sort of light purpley blue to the asters. Asters I always think of as having a very pretty periwinkle color, so white with ultramarine and magenta, and same thing as the pansies. If you want it a little cooler, add more ultramarine. And I'm just doing thin, delicate brush strokes to give the look of many multiple petals, thin little petals. While those dry, I'll mix a warm yellow for the marigold using light red, Naples yellow, and white. I'm going to come down here, do a messy bad job of filling in the flower. And then for this one, we're not going to let it dry. We're not going to do wet on dry for the detail. We're going to do a wet into wet technique. I'll add more light red and more Naples yellow to the pigment, darkening it slightly. And then I come down here, adding that darker pigment into the lightly wet area, and it gives me a really natural color blend that I think is just perfect for the marigold flower. Okay, the last flower to paint or to add color to is the chrysanthemum. And I've decided to repeat the sort of light magenta that we used on the water lily. Did a very messy sort of scribble of light color. And then again, we're using wet into wet to come in with a slightly darker magenta and release that color. Gives us a really organic, natural blend. Same thing with lifting. Lifting will give you a wonderful, natural blending of color. That's why it's so good for like clouds and skies and highlights, natural highlights. Anyways, we are almost done. We need to add a bit of green to the aster stems and leaves. Same thing with the marigold, but we have our green mixed up, so it's easy enough to just splash a playful hint of color. I think you guys are getting the point. We're not keeping it too close to the lines. I use the same light brown for the asters as I did for the daisy stamen. I added a little dot of yellow at the center of those violets. And then I took a darker purple and added a few messy lines to give detail to the aster petals. We're going to add one more leaf to the gladiola, a little bit of shadow underneath our water lily on the lily pad. And yeah, I was really just, again, stepping back from the composition. Where do I need a little more color? I added a leaf to the chrysanthemum, but then ultimately I was all done. I'm so happy with this. This was such a joyful, fun sketchbook piece to prepare. Going through the year of flowers allows you to practice them, and then they're easy to replicate on greeting cards if you're making birthday cards for friends. But yeah, this was a long video, so I'm gonna say goodbye. If you love this content, be sure to subscribe and support this channel. And if you really want to support this channel, go sign up for my Patreon. There is a bonus video waiting for you there since it is the start of February. Thank you, friends. I'll see you soon.